The 72-year-old woman's arthritic hands froze on the steering wheel, her weathered Ford Ranger skidding to a halt as she watched the police cruiser flip end over end into the churning Montana River below. Margaret O'Sullivan's coffee thermos hit the floorboard with a metallic clang. The overturned vehicle wasn't floating. It was sinking like a stone into the storm-swollen Flathead River. Kaiser, her German shepherd, launched himself through the open truck window before Maggie could even process what she was seeing, his powerful 75-pound frame hitting the water with a thunderous splash. The young police officer trapped inside the submerged cruiser had maybe 3 minutes before the icy water claimed another victim. Maggie's FBI training from 3 decades ago kicked in as she stumbled from her truck, her mind cataloging the impossible physics of the crash scene. No skid marks, no debris pattern. This wasn't an accident. "Dear God," she whispered, watching Kaiser battle the current toward the sinking car, "what have we stumbled into?" And why did the license plate number trigger a memory she'd tried so hard to forget? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Margaret Maggie O'Sullivan had never imagined that retirement would taste like instant coffee and loneliness. At 72, the former FBI behavioral analyst found herself rationing both grocery money and conversations. Her Social Security check of $1,247 barely covering the mortgage payments on the modest cabin she'd shared with her late husband Frank for 37 years. The foreclosure notice taped to her kitchen window served as a daily reminder that even heroes grow old and forgotten. 3 years of widowhood had taught Maggie that silence could be deafening. The mountain cabin that once echoed with Frank's laughter now held only the ticking of an old grandfather clock and the soft padding of Kaiser's paws across worn hardwood floors. Her German shepherd had been her salvation, literally. She'd found him 2 winters ago, half-starved and shivering beside Highway 2, his intelligent amber eyes holding the same hollow grief she recognized in her own mirror. "At my age, honey, every sunrise with you is a blessing," she'd tell Kaiser each morning as he dutifully brought her house slippers, his tail wagging with the enthusiasm of someone who still believed in purpose. The ritual had become sacred. Coffee at dawn, medications sorted into weekly pill organizers, and then their patrol of Glacier National Park's outer boundaries where Maggie volunteered as an unofficial guardian. Kaiser wasn't just a pet. He was family, partner, and therapist, rolled into one magnificent creature who somehow understood that his elderly human needed saving as much as she'd saved him. His presence filled the spaces where children's laughter should have been, where grandchildren's voices might have called her name. Maggie had dedicated her life to the Bureau, chasing monsters in human form while Frank waited patiently at home, until one day the waiting became permanent and the monsters retired to haunt only her dreams. The financial strain had become unbearable. $87,000 remaining on a mortgage she'd never expected to carry alone, medical bills stacking up like accusations of her body's betrayal, and the pride that wouldn't let her accept charity from neighbors who whispered about the crazy old FBI lady who talked to her dog like he was people. But Kaiser was people in every way that mattered. He anticipated her needs before she voiced them, guided her gently when her memory occasionally faltered, and never judged her for the tears that sometimes came without warning. His training, wherever he'd acquired it, exceeded anything she'd seen in Bureau K-9 units. He understood complex commands, demonstrated problem-solving skills that bordered on supernatural, and possessed an uncanny ability to sense danger hours before it materialized. This morning had been different. Kaiser had paced restlessly, whining at the basement door with an urgency that set Maggie's retired agent instincts humming. 30 years of profiling criminals had taught her to trust behavioral anomalies, and Kaiser's agitation felt like a warning she couldn't ignore. So when he'd leaped toward the truck with unusual determination, she'd followed without question. Now, watching him battle the river's current to reach a sinking police car, Maggie realized their quiet life was about to change forever. The morning had started with another foreclosure notice and ended with Maggie O'Sullivan questioning everything she thought she knew about coincidence. She'd woken at 5:47 a.m. to Kaiser nudging her hand with his wet nose. Unusual, since he typically waited for her alarm. The German shepherd's amber eyes held an urgency she'd learned not to ignore during their 2 years together. "What is it, boy?" she'd whispered, following him to the kitchen where he stood rigid beside the basement door, ears pinned forward in the classic alert position she remembered from her FBI days. Kaiser had never shown interest in the basement before. The space held only Frank's old fishing gear and boxes of case files she couldn't bear to destroy. The phone rang as she reached for her morning coffee, the harsh sound cutting through the mountain silence. First National Bank's automated system informed her she had 30 days to bring her mortgage current or face immediate foreclosure proceedings. $87,000. The number might as well have been $8 million for all the chance she had of raising it on her Social Security income. Kaiser whined again, pawing at the basement door with increasing agitation. Maggie had worked with enough canine units to recognize the signs. This wasn't normal dog behavior. This was a trained response to something specific, something her human senses couldn't detect. 25 miles away, Detective Sarah Chen was having her own morning of revelations. The pregnancy tests plus sign stared back at her from the precinct bathroom counter, confirming what her body had been trying to tell her for weeks. At 29, she'd thought she had her life mapped out. Detective by 30, sergeant by 35, maybe marriage and children somewhere in the distant future. The father, Jake Morrison, her partner and mentor, was supposedly dead, killed in the line of duty 3 months ago. But Jake's death report contained inconsistencies that kept Sarah awake at night. No body recovered from the river, dental records inconclusive due to fire damage, and now, impossibly, her phone showed 17 missed calls from a number she recognized as Jake's personal line. The text message that arrived at 11:30 a.m. changed everything. "Meet me at Bear Creek Bridge. Come alone. I have information about Webb case. Trust no one else. J." Sarah stared at the message until her eyes blurred. Jake Morrison was supposed to be dead. She'd attended his memorial service, watched his flag-draped coffin lowered into Riverside Cemetery. But the phone number was his, and only Jake knew her private fears about the Marcus Webb investigation, the inconsistencies that suggested a larger conspiracy within the department. Meanwhile, Maggie had given up trying to understand Kaiser's basement obsession and decided their usual patrol route through Glacier's outer boundaries might calm both their nerves. The German shepherd bounded toward her old Ford Ranger with enthusiasm that seemed forced, his tail wagging in sharp, anxious movements rather than the easy rhythm of happiness. "All right, boy, we'll take the long route today," she said, scratching behind his ears. Kaiser immediately jumped into the passenger seat, positioning himself to watch the road ahead with military precision. His behavior reminded her of the bomb detection dog she'd worked with during her bureau days. Hyper-alert, mission-focused, responding to stimuli beyond human perception. The storm clouds gathering over the Rockies matched Maggie's mood as they drove toward Bear Creek. 3 years of widowhood had taught her to read weather patterns and emotional barometers with equal skill. Today felt different, charged with the kind of electricity that preceded lightning strikes and life-changing moments. Kaiser's agitation increased as they approached the creek area, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow. He placed both front paws on the dashboard, nose pressed against the windshield, exhibiting the same behavior patterns Maggie had observed in narcotics dogs approaching a positive hit. But what could he possibly be detecting in this remote wilderness area? At exactly 3:30 p.m., Sarah Chen's patrol car rounded the bend toward Bear Creek Bridge, her radio crackling with routine dispatch calls that seemed to belong to another world. The pregnancy test sat in her jacket pocket like a secret that might explode if handled carelessly. Jake's message had specified this exact time and location, but something about the setup felt wrong, too convenient, too isolated. The bridge appeared through the rain-spattered windshield just as Sarah's phone buzzed again. Another text from Jake's number. "I can see you. Don't stop on the bridge. Pull over at the north end." But Sarah's police training kicked in as she noticed the fresh skid marks on the wet asphalt, the missing section of guardrail that hadn't been there during her patrol yesterday morning. Someone had crashed through the barrier recently, and the accident hadn't been reported. She grabbed her radio to call it in just as her patrol car hit the patch of motor oil deliberately spread across the bridge surface. The vehicle hydroplaned instantly, spinning sideways before crashing through the damaged guardrail section that someone had carefully weakened hours earlier. As her car flipped end over end toward the raging Flathead River below, Sarah Chen realized that Jake Morrison's death had been as carefully orchestrated as her own was about to be. The patrol car hit the water with a sound that would haunt Maggie O'Sullivan's dreams for years to come. Metal crushing against liquid concrete, followed by the terrible silence of something beautiful being destroyed. Kaiser's reaction was instantaneous and primal. Before Maggie could process what she was witnessing, 75 pounds of German Shepherd muscle launched through her truck's open window like a furry missile aimed at destiny. "Kaiser, no!" The words tore from her throat, but the dog was already airborne, his powerful hindquarters propelling him toward the river with the precision of a trained rescue animal. The sight triggered a memory fragment from her FBI days. Canine water rescue demonstrations at Quantico, dogs bred and trained for exactly this scenario. But Kaiser was supposed to be a stray she'd rescued from Highway 2, wasn't he? The overturned police cruiser was sinking fast, its weight pulling it toward the river bottom with mechanical inevitability. Maggie's retired agent brain automatically calculated the physics. Water temperature approximately 42 degrees. Submersion time already at 30 seconds. Occupant survival window narrowing to minutes rather than hours. She stumbled from her truck, arthritis forgotten in the surge of adrenaline that transported her back 3 decades to active duty scenarios. The license plate number on the sinking cruiser, Unit 247, triggered a cascade of recognition that made her blood run cold. She knew that number. It had appeared in her case files, connected to reports that had been mysteriously buried, witnesses who had suddenly changed their stories, evidence that disappeared from custody without explanation. Kaiser reached the car just as the driver's side window disappeared completely underwater. Through the rain-distorted windshield, Maggie glimpsed a young woman's face pressed against the remaining air pocket, her eyes wide with terror and the desperate mathematics of drowning. The officer was conscious but trapped, her hands clawing uselessly at door mechanisms designed to work in air, not underwater. Maggie's FBI training kicked in with muscle memory that transcended age and circumstance. She grabbed the rescue rope from her truck bed. Frank had insisted she carry emergency equipment during her volunteer patrols and tied one end to her trailer hitch. The other end she hurled toward the river, watching Kaiser's intelligent amber eyes track its trajectory. But the dog was already improvising solutions that shouldn't have been possible for an untrained animal. Kaiser dove beneath the surface, emerging seconds later with the rope clenched between his teeth, swimming against the current with strokes that spoke of professional water rescue training. His technique was textbook perfect. Angled approach to compensate for current, controlled breathing rhythm, eyes fixed on his target with laser-like focus. "Who trained you, boy?" Maggie whispered, but there was no time for mysteries. The cruiser was nearly submerged, only the roof and light bar still visible above the churning water. Inside, the young officer, Detective Sarah Chen, according to the nameplate visible through the rear window, had seconds of breathable air remaining. Kaiser reached the car and immediately began a systematic rescue protocol that confirmed Maggie's growing suspicions about his past. The dog positioned himself at the driver's side door, using his body weight to stabilize the sinking vehicle while somehow communicating to Sarah that help had arrived. His presence seemed to calm her panic, her desperate thrashing replaced by focused cooperation. But the door wouldn't budge. Water pressure and twisted metal had created a prison that even Kaiser's intelligence couldn't unlock. Maggie watched in helpless admiration as the German Shepherd switched tactics, diving repeatedly to examine the car from different angles, searching for alternative entry points with the methodical approach of a trained professional. The breakthrough came when Kaiser managed to work the rope through the car's emergency brake handle, creating a lifeline between the sinking vehicle and Maggie's truck. But the real miracle occurred when Sarah, following some instinct or training of her own, managed to activate the car's emergency window release system just as her last pocket of air disappeared. Water rushed in with devastating force, but Kaiser was ready. He grabbed Sarah's collar with his teeth, using the rope as a guide rope to pull both of them toward the surface. The current fought them every inch, threatening to sweep all three. Maggie was now in the water too, her 72-year-old body screaming in protest against the cold, downstream toward the rocks that had claimed other lives over the years. But Kaiser's strength proved extraordinary. Despite the current, despite Sarah's deadweight panic, despite the freezing water that should have sapped his energy within minutes, the German Shepherd fought his way to shore with a determination that bordered on supernatural. His eyes never left Maggie's face, as if drawing strength from their connection, as if their 2-year bond had been preparing him for exactly this moment. When they finally collapsed on the muddy riverbank, all three gasping and shivering, Maggie noticed details that would reshape everything she thought she knew about her quiet retirement life. Sarah Chen's service weapon was missing from its holster. The car's radio had been deliberately disabled, the antenna wire cleanly cut. And most disturbing of all, the brake lines showed clear evidence of sabotage, the hydraulic fluid still leaking into the river like mechanical blood. Someone had wanted Detective Sarah Chen dead. The crash wasn't an accident. It was attempted murder disguised as misadventure. And somehow, impossibly, Kaiser had known. His morning agitation, his urgency to patrol this specific route, his inexplicable water rescue expertise, none of it was coincidence. As Sarah coughed up river water and struggled to focus her eyes, her first words confirmed Maggie's worst suspicions. Jake Morrison set me up. He's alive, and he knows about the baby." She grabbed Maggie's arm with desperate strength. "You don't understand. I'm the only one who knows what really happened to Emily Webb, and now they're going to kill me for it." The pieces of a conspiracy 3 years in the making suddenly clicked into place in Maggie's trained investigator mind. Emily Webb. The missing child case that had been closed without resolution. The witnesses who recanted their statements. The evidence that vanished from federal custody. The case that had cost her FBI partner his life and sent Kaiser running into the wilderness to find her. The emergency room at Kalispell Regional Medical Center smelled like disinfectant and desperation, but to Maggie O'Sullivan it smelled like home. After 30 years of FBI fieldwork, she'd spent enough time in hospital corridors to recognize the subtle differences between routine medical emergencies and the kind of cases that attracted wolves in sheep's clothing. Tonight, she was certain they were being hunted. Sarah Chen lay in bed, 3 of the trauma bay, her dark hair still damp with river water, an IV line snaking from her left arm, while monitors tracked her vital signs with electronic persistence. The hypothermia had been severe enough to require active rewarming, but the pregnancy, 8 weeks along according to the blood work, had complicated treatment protocols. Every decision carried the weight of 2 lives. "The baby's fine," Dr. Patricia Hendricks had assured them both an hour earlier. "Strong heartbeat, normal hormone levels." But Detective Chen, you need to understand, stress at this level, especially repeated trauma, can affect fetal development. You need rest, proper nutrition, and absolutely no more river rescues. Maggie had smiled grimly at the doctor's attempt at humor, but her FBI instincts were screaming warnings that had nothing to do with medical care. The hospital's visitor log showed 3 people asking about Sarah's condition who weren't law enforcement or family. Security cameras in the parking lot had captured a familiar figure, Marcus Webb, watching the emergency entrance from the tree line. Most disturbing of all, Kaiser refused to leave Sarah's side. The German Shepherd had somehow convinced 3 different nurses that he was a certified therapy animal, his calm demeanor and obvious intelligence overriding normal hospital policies. But Maggie recognized his behavior pattern. Kaiser wasn't providing comfort. He was standing guard. "Tell me about Jake Morrison," Maggie said quietly, settling into the uncomfortable chair beside Sarah's bed. The young detective's eyes were clearer now, the initial shock of near drowning replaced by the sharp focus that Maggie remembered from her own active duty years. Sarah's hands moved instinctively to her stomach, a protective gesture that spoke volumes about her priorities. "Jake was my training officer when I made detective 2 years ago. Smart, experienced, everything you'd want in a mentor. We got involved 6 months ago. I thought he cared about me, but now I realize I was just convenient." "Convenient how?" "I stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to see. 3 months ago, I was working a routine burglary case in the warehouse district. While I was photographing the scene, I caught something in the background. Jake meeting with 2 men I later identified as known drug dealers." Money was changing hands. Maggie felt the familiar chill of a case breaking open. "You confronted him?" "Not directly. I tried to be smart about it, started documenting everything I could find. Jake's financial records, his case clearance rates, patterns in evidence handling. The corruption went back at least 2 years, maybe longer. And it wasn't just drugs. There were connections to missing person cases, including Emily Webb." The name hit Maggie like a physical blow. Emily Webb had been her partner Ryan Murphy's last case before his death in that convenient car accident. A 7-year-old girl who disappeared from a playground in broad daylight, witnesses who saw her talking to a police officer before she vanished, and then a sudden departmental decision to reclassify the case as a family abduction despite evidence to the contrary. "Jake Morrison was the lead investigator on Emily Webb," Maggie said, the pieces falling into place with horrible clarity. Sarah nodded. "He closed the case after 2 weeks, claimed the father took her during a custody dispute. But I found the real file. Emily's body was discovered 6 months later, buried in the national forest. Cause of death was blunt force trauma. Someone beat a 7-year-old girl to death, and Jake covered it up." Kaiser raised his head from where he'd been lying beside Sarah's bed, his ears pricked forward in the alert position that Maggie had learned to respect. The German Shepherd padded to the window, peering through the blinds with the focused attention of a trained surveillance operative. "Someone's watching us," Maggie said, trusting Kaiser's senses more than her own aging eyes. Sarah struggled to sit up despite the IV line. "Jake knows I'm alive. He'll come for me as soon as he thinks it's safe." "Then we make sure it's never safe." Maggie's voice carried the steel that had made her legendary in the behavioral analysis unit. "But first, we need to understand what we're really dealing with. Tell me about the pregnancy." Sarah's cheeks flushed, but she met Maggie's eyes steadily. It happened during a surveillance operation. Jake and I were undercover for 3 days, and I thought it meant something. But looking back, I think he planned it. He needed me compromised, emotionally invested, less likely to investigate him thoroughly. The manipulation sickened Maggie, but it fit the profile of someone who'd murdered a child and built a career on covering it up. When did he fake his death? 6 weeks ago. There was a raid on a meth lab out by Whitefish Lake. Jake volunteered to go in first, claimed he had an informant inside. The building exploded, supposedly with him in it. We never found enough remains for positive identification, but the department closed the book anyway. Kaiser's low growl interrupted their conversation. Through the window, Maggie glimpsed a figure moving through the parking lot with the practiced stealth of someone who understood surveillance patterns. Medium height, military bearing, wearing the kind of civilian clothes that screamed law enforcement training. "Is that Jake?" she whispered. Sarah peered through the blinds, her face going pale. "No. That's Marcus Webb, Emily's father." The irony wasn't lost on Maggie. The man they'd been hunting for 3 months had just walked into their trap. But as she watched Marcus Webb's approach, something about his body language suggested he wasn't here for revenge. His movements were cautious but not aggressive, and his hands remained visible at all times. "He's not armed," Sarah observed, her detective training overriding personal fear. "And he's walking directly toward the main entrance. If he wanted to hurt us, he wouldn't announce himself like this." 5 minutes later, Marcus Webb stood in the doorway of Sarah's hospital room, his weathered face carrying the permanent grief that Maggie recognized from too many victim interviews. He was smaller than she'd expected, maybe 5'8" with calloused hands and work boots that spoke of honest labor rather than criminal enterprise. "Detective Chen," he said quietly, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to warn you." Kaiser's reaction was telling. The German shepherd remained alert but didn't show the aggressive posture he'd displayed when sensing actual threats. If anything, his body language suggested recognition, as if he'd encountered Marcus Webb before under different circumstances. "Warn us about what?" Sarah asked, her hand moving to the call button despite her obvious curiosity. "Jake Morrison is alive, and he's not working alone. The corruption you discovered goes all the way to the state level. Prosecutors, judges, federal agents. They killed my Emily because she witnessed a drug handoff at her school. A police officer was supposed to be protecting the children, but instead he was selling poison to teenagers." Maggie felt the case expanding beyond anything she'd imagined. "You've been investigating this for 3 years?" Marcus nodded, sinking into the chair across from Sarah's bed with the exhaustion of a man who'd carried an impossible burden for too long. "I lost everything when Emily died. My wife left, my job, my sanity. But I never stopped looking for the truth. Jake Morrison murdered my daughter, and he's been covering it up ever since." "The evidence you have," Sarah began, "was stolen from my cabin 2 nights ago. Photos, documents, recordings, everything I'd gathered over 3 years. They knew I was getting close." Marcus's eyes found Kaiser, and something like recognition flickered between man and dog. "But they don't know about him." Kaiser walked over to Marcus, allowing the grieving father to stroke his head with gentle hands that trembled with suppressed emotion. The interaction triggered a memory cascade in Maggie's trained brain. She'd seen this behavior before during her bureau days when K-9 units worked with victims' families. "Kaiser knew your daughter," she said suddenly, the realization hitting like lightning. Marcus's eyes filled with tears. "Emily loved dogs. She volunteered at the animal shelter every weekend, helped train the rescue dogs. Kaiser was there. He was Agent Murphy's partner, working undercover at the shelter to investigate reports of animal abuse connected to drug operations." The timeline crystallized in Maggie's mind. Ryan Murphy had been investigating connections between the animal shelter, missing children, and drug trafficking. Emily Webb had been a witness, and Kaiser had been assigned to protect her. When Emily was murdered, both Murphy and Kaiser had been marked for elimination. "They killed Murphy to stop his investigation," she whispered, "and tried to kill Kaiser. But he escaped. He's been living wild for 2 years, waiting for someone he could trust." Marcus looked at Maggie with something approaching awe. "He chose you because you smell like Murphy. Same soap, same shampoo. Dogs never forget people they love." Sarah struggled to process the implications. So Kaiser isn't just any dog. He's a witness to Emily's murder? Before anyone could answer, the lights in the hospital corridor flickered and went out. Emergency power kicked in seconds later, bathing everything in the red glow of backup systems, but the message was clear. Someone with access to the hospital's infrastructure was making a move. Kaiser's growl filled the room, deep and threatening, his body positioned protectively between the door and the two women. In the distance, Maggie heard the sound she'd been dreading. Footsteps in the corridor, moving with the measured pace of someone who knew exactly where they were going. "Jake's here," Sarah whispered, her hand finding the call button just as the room's communication system mysteriously failed. Marcus Webb stood slowly, his face hardening with 3 years of accumulated rage. "Then it's time to finish this. He killed my little girl, and he's not walking away tonight." But Maggie's FBI training kicked in with cold clarity. This isn't about revenge anymore, it's about survival. And if we're going to live through the next hour, we need to start trusting each other completely. Outside in the corridor, Jake Morrison's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I know you're in there, Sarah. We need to talk." Kaiser's response was a growl that seemed to come from the depths of hell itself, promising that this conversation would happen on very different terms than Jake Morrison had planned. The hospital corridor stretched before Jake Morrison like a hunting ground, emergency lighting casting long shadows that danced with his memories of other nights, other kills that had been necessary for the greater good of his operation. At 38, Jake had perfected the art of looking like exactly what people expected from a police officer. Square jaw, steady hands, eyes that conveyed trustworthiness while concealing the calculating mind of a predator who'd turned badge and uniform into tools of personal enrichment. "Sarah, I know you're scared." His voice carried the practiced tone of authority mixed with false concern that had fooled colleagues for years. "But we need to discuss your future. And the baby's future. I'm not the monster you think I am." Inside room 314, Maggie O'Sullivan felt the familiar ice-cold clarity that had made her legendary in the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. Jake Morrison's voice patterns, his choice of words, even his footstep rhythm, everything screamed narcissistic sociopath with delusions of righteousness. She'd profiled dozens of men like him, criminals who'd convinced themselves their crimes served a higher purpose. "He's going to try to negotiate," she whispered to Sarah and Marcus. "Men like Jake believe they can talk their way out of any situation because they've done it before. But he's also desperate, which makes him exponentially more dangerous." Kaiser's positioning told a different story. The German shepherd had placed himself directly in front of the door, his body language suggesting he wasn't preparing for negotiation. He was preparing for war. His ears were pinned forward, muscles coiled with the tension of a spring about to release, and his eyes held the focused intensity that Maggie recognized from combat-trained military dogs. Sarah struggled to sit up straighter, her detective training warring with the maternal instincts that had awakened since learning about her pregnancy. "Jake doesn't know about Marcus being here. That might give us an advantage. Or it might get us all killed," Marcus replied quietly, checking the .38 revolver he'd pulled from his jacket. "I've been hunting this bastard for 3 years. He's not going to surrender just because we outnumber him." The sound of Jake's footsteps stopped directly outside their door. Through the frosted glass window they could see his silhouette. tall, broad-shouldered, holding what appeared to be a service weapon in a deceptively casual grip. His shadow seemed to fill the entire doorframe, blocking out the emergency lighting from the corridor beyond. "Sarah, I'm coming in now. Don't do anything foolish." The door handle turned slowly, deliberately, with the confidence of someone who believed they held all the advantages. But Jake Morrison had made a critical error in his risk assessment. He'd planned for Sarah Chen, injured, isolated, emotionally compromised by pregnancy and trauma. He'd even anticipated the possibility of hospital security or local police interference. What he hadn't counted on was walking into a room containing a retired FBI profiler, a grieving father with nothing left to lose, and a German shepherd with specialized training in neutralizing armed suspects. The door opened just as Kaiser launched himself forward with the precision of a guided missile. 75 pounds of muscle and fury collided with Jake's center mass, driving him backward into the corridor wall with an impact that rattled the emergency exit sign. Jake's service weapon, a Glock 19 that he'd modified with illegal hollow-point ammunition, spun across the polished floor, coming to rest near a medical cart loaded with supplies. "Kaiser! Hold!" Maggie's command carried the authority of someone who'd worked with K-9 units for decades. The German shepherd immediately shifted his attack pattern, maintaining physical control of Jake while avoiding potentially lethal force. His teeth found purchase on Jake's gun arm, applying just enough pressure to prevent movement without causing arterial damage. Jake's reaction revealed the depth of his desperation. Instead of the controlled response of a trained officer, he thrashed wildly, his face contorting with rage that stripped away years of careful image management. "You fucking bitch! Do you have any idea what you've cost me? I've got $27 million in offshore accounts, and you're going to ruin everything for what? Professional ethics?" The confession spilled out with the unstoppable force of 3 years' worth of suppressed anxiety. Jake Morrison had been living with the constant stress of maintaining multiple identities, managing an extensive criminal network, and eliminating threats to his operation. Now, faced with the collapse of everything he'd built, his psychological defenses crumbled completely. "$27 million?" Sarah's voice carried disbelief mixed with horror. "Jake, how many people did you kill for that money?" "People who were already dead," Jake snarled, Kaiser's grip preventing him from rising from the floor. "Addicts, criminals, degenerates who contributed nothing to society. I was doing community service, cleaning up the streets while building something meaningful with the profits." Maggie stepped forward, her FBI training allowing her to read Jake's psychological profile like a textbook. Emily Webb wasn't an addict or a degenerate. She was 7 years old. The mention of Emily's name triggered a visible shift in Jake's demeanor. His struggles against Kaiser's hold intensified, but now they carried the manic energy of someone whose carefully constructed rationalization system was being dismantled piece by piece. "Emily was an accident!" he screamed. "She wasn't supposed to be at the school that day. The drug handoff was supposed to happen during regular hours when the kids were in class. But she was there for some stupid after-school program, saw everything, started asking questions. What was I supposed to do? Let a 7-year-old destroy years of careful planning?" Marcus Webb's movement was so sudden that even Maggie's trained reflexes couldn't intercept him. 3 years of grief and rage propelled him across the room toward Jake with the single-minded fury of a father seeking justice for his murdered child. But Sarah's voice stopped him mid-stride. "Marcus, don't." Her words carried surprising authority for someone lying in a hospital bed with an IV line. "If you kill him, we'll never know who else was involved. Emily deserves better than just revenge. She deserves the truth." The wisdom of Sarah's words penetrated Marcus's rage-clouded thinking. He stopped inches from Jake's face, his hands trembling with the effort of restraining himself. "Tell me who gave you the orders." Tell me who else was involved in killing my little girl." Jake's laughter was ugly, brittle with the hysteria of someone who'd realized his situation was hopeless. "You think I was taking orders? You think I'm some low-level dealer following someone else's plan? I built this organization from nothing. I recruited the judges, the prosecutors, the federal agents. I decided who lived and who died." The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Maggie's analytical mind began cataloging the implications. Corruption networks typically grew organically, starting with small compromises and escalating over time. For Jake to claim leadership of such an extensive operation suggested either grandiose delusion or a level of criminal sophistication that would have required years to develop. "The animal shelter," she said suddenly, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. "You used the shelter as a front for money laundering and drug distribution. Children who volunteered there were perfect targets, vulnerable, trusting, with regular schedules you could predict." Jake's expression confirmed her theory. "Brilliant, wasn't it? Who suspects a police officer volunteering at an animal rescue? I had access to kids from broken homes, addicts looking for their next fix, and enough legitimate animal rescue work to provide cover for the real operation." Sarah felt sick as the full horror of Jake's crimes became clear. "How many children, Jake? How many kids did you hurt?" "Define hurt," Jake replied, with the casual cruelty of someone who'd lost all connection to human empathy. "Some became customers. Kids make excellent dealers because adults don't suspect them. Some became witnesses who needed to be managed. Emily was just the first one who couldn't be reasoned with." Kaiser's growl deepened, as if the German shepherd understood the content of Jake's confession. The dog's grip on Jake's arm tightened incrementally, a physical reminder that justice sometimes had teeth and claws rather than gavels and prison cells. But Jake Morrison had one more card to play. His free hand had been slowly working toward the backup weapon concealed in his ankle holster. A snub-nosed .38 that he'd carried for exactly this type of emergency. Hospital security would arrive eventually, but he only needed 30 seconds to eliminate the 3 witnesses who could destroy everything he'd built. The shot that echoed through the corridor came not from Jake's concealed weapon, but from Marcus Webb's .38 revolver. The grieving father's aim was precise. Jake's shoulder, disabling without killing, ensuring that Emily's murderer would face trial rather than escape into death. "That's for my little girl," Marcus said quietly, the gun still smoking in his trembling hands. "Now you get to live with what you've done, just like the rest of us." As Jake Morrison lay bleeding on the hospital floor, Kaiser finally released his grip and padded over to Maggie, his tail wagging with the satisfaction of a job well done. In the distance, the sound of approaching sirens suggested that their ordeal was nearly over, but Maggie's FBI instincts told her that Jake's arrest was just the beginning. $27 million and a corruption network spanning multiple states didn't disappear overnight. Somewhere out there, other predators were already moving to protect their interests, and the 3 survivors in room 314 had just painted targets on their backs. The veterinary emergency clinic at 2:47 a.m. felt like a cathedral of desperation, fluorescent lights humming prayers over the still form of Kaiser lying on the stainless steel examination table. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez worked with the focused intensity of someone who understood that miracles sometimes required medical intervention, her hands moving carefully around the German shepherd's chest where Jake Morrison's final, desperate shot had found its mark. Maggie O'Sullivan sat in the plastic waiting room chair, her arthritic hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned white. At 72, she'd buried a husband, lost colleagues, and watched the world change in ways that sometimes left her feeling like a relic from a more honorable era. But the thought of losing Kaiser, her partner, protector, and only family, threatened to break something in her soul that she wasn't sure could be repaired. The bullet missed his heart by less than an inch, Dr. Rodriguez had explained an hour earlier, her voice carrying the professional calm that medical professionals use to deliver devastating news gently. But it punctured his right lung and nicked a major artery. We need to operate immediately, but I have to be honest. The surgery will cost at least $12,000, and even then his chances are only about 40%. The number echoed in Maggie's mind like a death sentence. $12,000 might as well have been $12 million for someone living on Social Security, facing foreclosure, choosing between prescription medications and grocery money. The cruel irony wasn't lost on her. Kaiser had saved 2 lives tonight, and now she couldn't save his. Sarah Chen sat beside her, still wearing the hospital gown under a donated coat, her own gunshot wound bandaged but secondary to the crisis unfolding in the surgical suite. The young detective had insisted on coming despite doctors' orders to rest, driven by a guilt that Maggie recognized from her own years of making impossible choices in dangerous situations. "This is my fault," Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. "If I hadn't gotten involved with Jake, if I'd been smarter about the investigation, Kaiser wouldn't have been there to save me. He wouldn't be dying because of my mistakes." Marcus Webb had been silent for the past hour, staring at his hands with the hollow expression of someone who'd spent 3 years planning revenge, only to discover that justice felt nothing like satisfaction. Jake Morrison's arrest should have provided closure, but instead it had revealed the true scope of a conspiracy that had claimed his daughter and now threatened the only creature who'd shown him kindness since Emily's death. "I have money," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the ambient sounds of medical equipment and late-night emergencies. Emily's life insurance, the settlement from the department's wrongful death claim, it's all sitting in accounts I've never touched because spending it felt like profiting from her murder. Maggie looked up sharply. "Marcus, you don't owe us anything." "Yes, I do." His eyes found hers across the waiting room, and she saw something that hadn't been there before. Peace, perhaps, or the beginning of it. "Kaiser loved my little girl. He was supposed to protect her. And when he couldn't, it broke something in him just like it broke something in me. Tonight, he protected Sarah and you instead. Maybe that's what Emily would have wanted. Her death meaning something, helping someone else's family stay together." The veterinary surgeon emerged from the operating room at 4:15 a.m., her scrubs stained with blood and her expression unreadable. Maggie's heart stopped as she searched the doctor's face for any hint of hope or devastation, her FBI training temporarily useless against the raw terror of potentially losing the creature she loved most in the world. "He's alive," Dr. Rodriguez said, and Maggie felt her knees buckle with relief. The surgery was successful, but he's not out of danger yet. The next 48 hours will be critical. His body has been through tremendous trauma, and at his age recovery will be slow. "Can we see him?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "One at a time, and only for a few minutes. He's sedated, but sometimes they can sense familiar voices even under anesthesia." Maggie entered the recovery room first, her heart breaking at the sight of Kaiser, surrounded by tubes and monitors, his magnificent chest rising and falling with mechanical assistance. The German shepherd, who'd launched himself fearlessly into a raging river that morning, looked impossibly small and vulnerable under the harsh medical lighting. "I'm here, boy," she whispered, gently stroking his head where it wasn't covered by bandages. "You did so good today. You saved Sarah. You saved the baby. You helped catch the bad guy. Frank would be so proud of you." Kaiser's tail moved, barely a twitch, but enough to confirm that some part of him recognized her voice and found comfort in her presence. The simple gesture unleashed 3 years' worth of suppressed emotion, and Maggie found herself crying with the raw grief of someone who'd held too much loss inside for too long. When Sarah took her turn at Kaiser's bedside, she placed one hand on his head and the other on her still flat stomach where Jake Morrison's child was growing. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for saving us both. I promise you, this baby will know about the hero dog who made sure they had a chance to be born." Marcus was last, and his visit lasted only seconds. He knelt beside the examination table, his weathered hands gentle on Kaiser's fur, and spoke words meant for both the unconscious dog and the little girl who would never hear them. "I forgive you for not being able to save her. And Emily forgives you too." The financial arrangements happened with surprising simplicity. Marcus transferred $15,000 from Emily's memorial fund, enough to cover Kaiser's surgery and several months of aftercare. The paperwork was signed in the pre-dawn darkness of the veterinary office, three strangers bound together by tragedy and hope, creating a family from the wreckage of their individual losses. But as the sun rose over Kalispell, painting the Montana sky in shades of pink and gold, Maggie's FBI instincts reminded her that Jake Morrison's arrest was only the beginning. $27 million in criminal proceeds didn't disappear overnight, and corruption networks had a way of protecting themselves through violence when legal maneuvering failed. The phone call came at 7:30 a.m., just as Maggie was dozing in the veterinary office's waiting room. The voice was electronically disguised, but the message was clear. "You have 48 hours to disappear. Take the girl and the old man and get out of Montana. Kaiser's surgery was expensive, but funerals are even more costly." Sarah saw the blood drain from Maggie's face as she ended the call. "What is it?" "Jake's partners," Maggie said quietly. "They know what we did last night, and they're not planning to let us testify at his trial." The tragedy wasn't Kaiser's injuries or the financial cost of his surgery. The real tragedy was the realization that their victory over Jake Morrison had only revealed the true scope of their enemies, and now they faced a choice between running forever or fighting a war they weren't sure they could win. But as Kaiser's monitors continued their steady rhythm, marking each precious heartbeat with electronic precision, Maggie felt something she hadn't experienced since Frank's death. The fierce protectiveness of someone who'd found a family worth fighting for. The truth hit Maggie O'Sullivan like a physical blow as she stared at the veterinary records spread across the clinic's conference table. Kaiser's microchip registration didn't list her as his owner. It listed Agent Ryan Murphy, FBI K-9 unit, with a federal ID number that had been deactivated exactly 3 years, 4 months, and 12 days ago. The day her partner had died in what everyone believed was a tragic car accident on Highway 2. "Ryan never told me he had a dog," she whispered, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew they were a lie. The FBI didn't allow agents to discuss their K-9 partners' identities or assignments outside official channels. If Ryan had been working an undercover operation involving Kaiser, she wouldn't have known about it unless she was directly involved in the case. Dr. Rodriguez looked uncomfortable as she explained the discovery. "The chip also contains medical records going back 4 years. Kaiser isn't just any German shepherd. He's been trained in water rescue, explosive detection, and what the records describe as tactical human tracking. His purchase price was listed at $78,000. Sarah Chen felt the pieces of a 3-year-old puzzle clicking into place with horrible clarity. Jake said Ryan Murphy was getting too close to something. What if Ryan wasn't killed because of what he knew about Jake's operation? What if he was killed because of what Kaiser knew? The German shepherd in question was sleeping fitfully in the recovery room, sedated but occasionally whimpering as if reliving traumatic memories. Every few minutes his legs would move in the running motion that dogs displayed during dreams, but these movements seemed different, desperate, as if he was trying to escape from something that existed only in his unconscious mind. Marcus Webb had been silent for most of the morning, but now he spoke with the quiet intensity of someone who'd spent 3 years assembling fragments of truth into a coherent picture. Emily's autopsy report mentioned animal hair found on her clothing. The forensics team couldn't identify the breed, but they noted it was consistent with a large working dog. Kaiser was there when she was murdered, Maggie said, the realization making her feel physically sick. He witnessed Jake kill your daughter, and Ryan was trying to use Kaiser's testimony to build a case. The concept of canine testimony wasn't unprecedented in law enforcement. Properly trained dogs could lead investigators to crime scenes, identify suspects through scent recognition, and demonstrate behaviors that constituted evidence in criminal proceedings. Kaiser's training records indicated he'd been specifically prepared for exactly this type of work. But the implications extended far beyond Emily Webb's murder. If Kaiser had been present for other crimes committed by Jake Morrison's network, the German Shepherd represented a living database of criminal evidence that could destroy dozens of careers and expose corruption reaching into the highest levels of state and federal law enforcement. That's why they wanted him dead, Sarah said. Not just to cover up Emily's murder, but to eliminate years' worth of evidence about other crimes. The phone rang before anyone could respond, its shrill tone cutting through the morning quiet like an alarm. Dr. Rodriguez answered with her professional voice, but her expression quickly shifted to concern as she listened to the caller. "I understand," she said finally. "We'll be here." She hung up and turned to face the others with the expression of someone delivering bad news. "That was Detective Lieutenant Morrison from the State Police. Jake Morrison's federal arraignment has been scheduled for this afternoon, and they want Kaiser transported to the courthouse as evidence." "Evidence?" Maggie felt her protective instincts flaring. He just had major surgery 12 hours ago. Moving him could kill him. "They're not asking," Dr. Rodriguez replied quietly. "The warrant specifies that Kaiser is federal property being held illegally, and failure to comply with the transport order constitutes obstruction of justice." Marcus stood up slowly, his weathered hands clenching into fists. "It's a setup. They're going to kill him during transport and claim it was complications from his injuries." The assessment was almost certainly accurate, but recognizing a trap didn't automatically provide a way to escape it. Kaiser was in no condition to be moved, much less to endure the stress of a federal courthouse appearance. But refusing to comply would result in armed federal agents arriving within hours to seize him by force. Sarah's phone buzzed with an incoming text message that changed everything. The number was blocked, but the message was clear. "Check your email. Trust no one in uniform. A friend." The email contained a single attachment, a video file dated 3 years ago, showing the interior of what appeared to be an abandoned warehouse. The timestamp indicated the recording had been made 2 days before Ryan Murphy's death, and the audio quality was surprisingly clear despite the obvious covert nature of the filming. On screen, Jake Morrison stood beside a shipping container that had been converted into a makeshift laboratory. Bags of white powder covered a folding table, and several men in suits were examining the product with the professional interest of bulk purchasers. But the most shocking element was the presence of a man in a federal agent's jacket directing the operation. "That's Assistant Director Carlton Hayes," Maggie whispered, recognizing her former supervisor from the FBI's Criminal Investigative Division. "He was Ryan's boss. He signed off on the investigation that cleared Jake of any wrongdoing in Emily's death." The video continued for 12 minutes, documenting a drug transaction involving federal agents, local law enforcement, and civilian distributors. Near the end, the camera angle shifted to show Kaiser positioned behind a stack of shipping pallets, his intelligent eyes tracking every movement while wearing a harness equipped with recording equipment. "Ryan was building a case against his own superiors," Sarah said. "Kaiser was his backup recorder in case something happened to the primary surveillance equipment." The final frames of the video showed Jake Morrison notice the hidden camera, his face contorting with rage as he realized he'd been recorded. The timestamp jumped forward 6 minutes, then showed Jake and 2 federal agents searching the warehouse systematically, looking for surveillance equipment they knew had to exist but couldn't locate. The video ended with Kaiser's perspective, low to the ground, moving rapidly through darkness toward what appeared to be a vehicle. The German Shepherd had escaped with evidence that could destroy careers and expose a conspiracy involving millions of dollars in drug trafficking proceeds. "They've been hunting him for 3 years," Marcus said, "and now they know exactly where he is." The sound of vehicles approaching the veterinary clinic confirmed their worst fears. Through the window, Maggie counted 4 black SUVs with federal license plates, their occupants emerging with the coordinated movements of a tactical team. The lead vehicle carried Assistant Director Hayes himself, his presence confirming that this operation had the highest priority. "Dr. Rodriguez," Maggie said urgently, "is there another way out of this building? Service entrance in the back, but it leads to an alley that connects to the main street. They'll have it covered." Sarah was already moving toward the recovery room where Kaiser lay unconscious. "Then we don't run. We make our stand here." "With what?" Marcus asked. "I've got 6 rounds in my .38 and you're recovering from hypothermia. We can't fight federal agents." But Maggie's FBI training provided a different perspective. "We don't fight them, we embarrass them. Hayes is here personally because he can't afford to have this operation go public. He needs Kaiser to disappear quietly without media attention or legal scrutiny." She pulled out her phone and began recording, her voice taking on the authoritative tone she'd perfected during 3 decades of federal service. "This is retired Special Agent Margaret O'Sullivan, badge number 22847, documenting what appears to be an illegal seizure operation conducted by Assistant Director Carlton Hayes at the Kalispell Veterinary Emergency Clinic." The front door opened before she could continue, and Hayes entered with the calm confidence of someone accustomed to having his orders followed without question. At 55, he maintained the physical bearing of an agent despite 20 years of desk assignments, and his eyes held the cold calculation of someone who'd made peace with necessary compromises. "Maggie," he said with false warmth, "you're looking well for someone who should have died in a car accident 3 years ago." The admission was delivered so casually that it took several seconds for its full implications to register. Hayes wasn't just acknowledging the conspiracy, he was admitting that Ryan Murphy's death had been planned, and that Maggie had been intended as collateral damage. "You killed Ryan?" she said, her voice steady despite the rage building in her chest. "Ryan killed himself by refusing to understand how the world really works," Hayes replied. "We offered him partnership, percentage of profits, comfortable retirement in 20 years. Instead, he chose self-righteousness and got himself eliminated." Kaiser's low growl from the recovery room indicated that the German Shepherd was conscious and responding to familiar voices. Despite his injuries, despite the sedation, some part of his trained awareness recognized the presence of people who represented mortal danger. Hayes smiled at the sound, his expression carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd finally cornered a long-sought prize. 3 years of hunting that animal, and he ends up in the hands of Ryan's old partner. The irony is almost poetic. But Maggie's phone was still recording, and her FBI training had taught her the value of making criminals talk when they believed they held all the advantages. "Tell me about the $27 million, Carlton. How many children's lives was that money worth?" The question struck home with surgical precision, and Hayes' mask of professional calm slipped for just an instant. In that moment, Maggie saw the truth. He wasn't a corrupt federal agent making calculated decisions for financial gain. He was a monster who'd convinced himself that children were acceptable casualties in a war against drugs that had become indistinguishable from the drug trade itself. The recording would ensure that Kaiser's story survived, even if none of them did. But first, they had to live long enough to get it to people who could use it to expose the truth. The transformation of Kalispell Veterinary Emergency Clinic into an impromptu battleground happened with the surreal quality of a nightmare bleeding into daylight. Assistant Director Carlton Hayes had brought enough firepower to siege a small fortress, but he'd underestimated the power of social media in the hands of a desperate 72-year-old woman who'd spent 3 decades learning how to expose criminals. Maggie's live Facebook stream had been running for 7 minutes when the first news van arrived. Her granddaughter in Seattle, Frank's daughter from his first marriage, had shared the video with her journalism contacts, and within minutes, the story was spreading across social platforms with the viral intensity that only genuine human drama could generate. Elderly FBI agent and hero dog surrounded by corrupt feds was trending on Twitter, and the hashtag #SaveKaiser had gained 3,000 followers in the time it took Hayes to realize his carefully planned quiet operation had become a very public relations disaster. "Turn off the phone, Maggie," Hayes said, his voice carrying the edge of someone whose carefully constructed career was crumbling in real time. "You're interfering with a federal investigation." "I'm documenting a federal crime," Maggie replied, keeping the camera focused on Hayes while Sarah and Marcus positioned themselves between the recovery room and the armed agents. "Viewers, what you're witnessing is the attempted murder of a federal witness who survived an assassination attempt 3 years ago." The comment section of her live stream exploded with responses from viewers who recognized the broader implications of what they were seeing. Retired law enforcement officers, veterans, dog lovers, and ordinary citizens who understood that corruption at this level threatened the foundations of justice itself. The viewer count climbed past 5,000, then 10,000, as people shared the stream with networks of friends and family. Kaiser's condition had deteriorated during the confrontation. Dr. Rodriguez emerged from the recovery room with the grim expression of someone delivering terminal news. "His blood pressure is spiking from the stress. If we don't get him somewhere quiet and calm within the next hour, he's going to go into cardiac arrest." "That won't be necessary," Hayes said coldly. "Agent Morrison, prepare to transport the animal." The federal agent who stepped forward was young, maybe 28, with the earnest face of someone who'd joined the Bureau believing in justice and constitutional principles. But when he looked at Kaiser through the recovery room window, the German shepherd struggling to lift his head despite the sedation, his eyes clouded with pain but still showing the fierce intelligence that had made him such an effective partner, something in Agent Morrison's expression changed. "Sir," the young agent said carefully, "the animal appears to be in medical distress. Transport could be fatal." "That's not your concern, Agent Morrison. Your concern is following orders." The exchange was being broadcast live to nearly 15,000 viewers, many of whom were recording the stream on their own devices. Hayes was trapped between the need to eliminate Kaiser quickly and the growing media attention that made violence increasingly untenable, but cornered predators were often most dangerous when they felt their escape routes closing. Sarah had been silent for several minutes, but now she stepped forward with the careful movements of someone who understood she was walking into a minefield. "Assistant Director Hayes, I'm Detective Sarah Chen, Kalispell Police Department. I'm also 8 weeks pregnant with Jake Morrison's child." The revelation hit Hayes like a physical blow. His carefully controlled expression cracked, revealing the calculating mind beneath. A pregnant police detective represented complications he hadn't anticipated. Another witness, another story that could generate sympathy, another person whose death would attract unwanted scrutiny. "The baby's father is in federal custody," Sarah continued, her voice steady, despite the magnitude of the risk she was taking. "But I've been documenting his confessions about the corruption network he helped build. $27 million in drug proceeds, dozens of murders, federal agents selling protection to traffickers, all of it recorded and stored in multiple locations. It was a bluff, But Hayes couldn't be certain of that. Sarah's calm delivery and specific details made the claim credible enough to pause his immediate plans. The live stream viewers had climbed past 20,000, and news helicopters were now circling overhead, their cameras capturing aerial footage of the standoff. Marcus Webb chose that moment to reveal his own trump card. "I've been working with investigative journalists for 6 months," he said quietly. "Everything we discovered about Emily's murder, about Jake's network, about federal agents protecting drug dealers, it's all documented and ready for publication. Kill us, and the story goes public within 24 hours." The claim was partially true. Marcus had indeed been corresponding with reporters, sharing pieces of his investigation in carefully measured doses, but the full story, the complete scope of the conspiracy, existed primarily in Kaiser's recorded memories and the evidence that Ryan Murphy had died trying to preserve. Hayes's radio crackled with updates from his tactical team. Local law enforcement was arriving in force, drawn by the media attention and the growing crowd of citizens who'd driven to the veterinary clinic after seeing the live stream. Sheriff's deputies, city police, state troopers, all positioning themselves in ways that made a violent resolution increasingly complicated. But the real game changer came when Dr. Rodriguez received a phone call from someone claiming to represent the American Civil Liberties Union. The ACLU attorney, working pro bono after being contacted by viewers of the live stream, was already drafting emergency injunctions to prevent Kaiser's transport pending a full judicial review of his status as evidence versus victim. "You have 30 minutes to comply with the federal warrant," Hayes said, but his voice had lost its authoritative edge. He was improvising now, making tactical decisions in response to rapidly changing circumstances rather than executing a carefully planned operation. Maggie's phone buzzed with a text message that changed everything. "Margaret, this is Director Patricia Williams, FBI. I'm watching your live stream. Hold your position. Federal assistance is en route. Do not surrender Kaiser to Hayes under any circumstances." The message was from the current director of the FBI, Maggie's former colleague who'd risen through the ranks during the years since Maggie's retirement. Patricia Williams had the authority to countermand Hayes' orders, and her intervention suggested that the corruption investigation had reached the highest levels of federal law enforcement. "Carlton," Maggie said, showing him the text message, "you're about to be arrested by your own agency. The only question is whether you surrender now or make this worse by continuing to threaten witnesses." Hayes's face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, rage, calculation, and finally, resignation. 3 years of careful planning, millions of dollars in criminal proceeds, dozens of eliminated witnesses, all of it crumbling because an elderly woman and a wounded dog had refused to disappear quietly. The sound of approaching helicopters grew louder, but these weren't news aircraft. The distinctive rotor signature indicated federal transport, specifically the kind used by FBI tactical teams for high-priority operations. Hayes's radio suddenly came alive with chatter from agents who weren't under his command, agents who'd received very different orders about the situation at the veterinary clinic. "All federal personnel, stand down immediately. This is FBI Assistant Director Patricia Williams. Agent Hayes, you are relieved of command pending internal investigation." The voice came through Hayes's radio with crystal clarity, audible to everyone in the room as well as the 25,000 people watching the live stream. The coup de grace came when Williams continued. "Local law enforcement, please provide protective custody for the witnesses and ensure the safety of the federal K-9 asset." Kaiser's tail moved. Barely a twitch, but enough to indicate that some part of his consciousness recognized the changed atmosphere in the room. The German Shepherd had survived 3 years in the wilderness, a brutal assassination attempt, major surgery, and now a federal standoff. His survival instincts, honed by trauma and training, told him that the immediate danger had passed. Agent Morrison, the young federal agent who'd questioned Hayes's orders, stepped forward with visible relief. "Ma'am," he said to Maggie, "I need to apologize on behalf of the Bureau. This operation was conducted without proper authorization, and Agent Hayes has been under investigation for several months." The anticlimactic nature of Hayes's surrender was almost disappointing after the intensity of the confrontation. He simply removed his weapon, placed it on the examination table, and raised his hands in the universal gesture of defeat. 3 years of criminal enterprise, dozens of murders, millions in drug proceeds, all ending with the quiet click of handcuffs applied by agents who'd once served under his command. But as the immediate crisis resolved and the media circus began to dissipate, Maggie found herself facing a different kind of challenge. Kaiser was safe, the corruption network was exposed, and justice was finally within reach. Yet the German Shepherd's medical condition remained critical, and the emotional bonds forged during their ordeal were about to be tested by the reality of federal ownership and bureaucratic procedures. Sarah placed her hand protectively over her stomach, thinking about the child who would grow up knowing that a hero dog had saved their life before they were even born. Marcus Webb stood quietly beside Kaiser's recovery bed, finally experiencing the peace that had eluded him since Emily's death. And Maggie realized that saving Kaiser had given her something she'd lost when Frank died, a family worth fighting for. And the knowledge that heroism sometimes came on 4 legs with a tail that wagged even in the face of impossible odds. The story was far from over, but for the first time in 3 years, the ending looked like it might be worth all the pain it had taken to reach it. The golden light of Montana's autumn afternoon streamed through the windows of what had once been Maggie O'Sullivan's lonely cabin, but now buzzed with the warm chaos of chosen family. 6 months had passed since the standoff at the veterinary clinic, and the small house had been transformed from a shrine to solitude into something resembling the home Maggie had always dreamed of, but never dared to hope for. Kaiser lay on his custom orthopedic bed beside the fireplace, his recovery nothing short of miraculous, according to Dr. Rodriguez. The German Shepherd's left side showed the faint scar from his surgery, but his eyes held the bright intelligence that had made him legendary among the FBI's K-9 unit. At 7 years old, he'd officially retired from federal service with full honors and a pension that covered his medical care for life. More importantly, the adoption papers that made Maggie his legal owner were framed on the mantelpiece, signed personally by FBI Director Patricia Williams. "Grandma Maggie, can Kaiser come to my school for show and tell?" The voice belonged to 5-year-old Emily Sarah Chen Martinez, Sarah's daughter who'd been born exactly 9 months after that terrifying night at the river. The little girl had inherited her mother's determination and her biological father's intelligence, but thankfully none of Jake Morrison's darkness. She'd grown up knowing Kaiser as her protector, her playmate, and the hero who'd made sure she had a chance to be born. Sarah looked up from where she was grading papers at the kitchen table, her detective badge exchanged 2 years ago for a teacher's credentials. The transition from law enforcement to education had been difficult initially, but working with children had provided healing that therapy alone couldn't accomplish. "We'll ask Kaiser if he feels up to it, sweetheart. Remember, he's getting older and needs his rest." The German Shepherd's tail thumped against his bed in response to his name, and he lifted his graying muzzle toward Emily with the patient affection that had made him beloved throughout the community. Kaiser had become something of a local celebrity, his story inspiring a children's book, a Hallmark movie, and annual donations to the animal rescue shelter that now bore his name. Marcus Webb emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of his famous chocolate chip cookies, the recipe that had been Emily's favorite and now served as his way of honoring her memory through joy rather than grief. At 62, he'd found purpose as the unofficial grandfather of their extended family, His military precision channeled into elaborate birthday parties, school fundraisers, and the kind of steadfast reliability that every family needed, but not every family was blessed to find. "The first batch is still cooling," he announced, "but I've got snickerdoodles coming out of the oven in 10 minutes if anyone's interested." The transformation in Marcus had been the most dramatic of all. The hollow-eyed man, consumed by rage and grief, had been replaced by someone who understood that the best revenge against those who'd stolen innocence was to create more innocence in the world. His therapy sessions with Dr. Patricia Collins had helped him process Emily's death. But his real healing had come through building something beautiful with the family that had chosen him. Maggie watched the domestic scene with the deep satisfaction of someone who'd lived long enough to understand that happiness often arrived disguised as ordinary moments. At 78, she'd defied every statistical expectation about aging, her purpose renewed by the responsibility of being needed. The Social Security checks that had once barely covered mortgage payments now supplemented Sarah's teacher salary and Marcus's veteran benefits, creating a household economy based on mutual support rather than individual struggle. The financial picture had changed dramatically after the federal settlement. Jake Morrison's criminal assets, $27 million recovered from offshore accounts, had been distributed among his victims' families. Emily Webb's portion had funded college scholarships for children affected by drug violence. Sarah's settlement had purchased the house outright and established trust funds for little Emily's education. Maggie's portion had gone entirely to animal rescue organizations, honoring Kaiser's service and Frank's memory. But the real wealth was measured in different currency entirely. Sunday dinners around the table that seats 8, Kaiser's gentle supervision of Emily's homework sessions. Sarah's evolution from isolated detective to beloved third-grade teacher. Marcus's transformation from grief-stricken father to devoted grandfather figure. Maggie's discovery that her FBI skills translated perfectly to helping with school science projects and mediating playground disputes. The phone rang, interrupting the peaceful afternoon, and Sarah answered with the cautious tone that still surfaced occasionally when she remembered that their story had made them public figures. But her expression quickly shifted to delight as she recognized the caller. "It's Director Williams," she announced to the room. "The documentary just won an Emmy." The HBO documentary, Kaiser's Courage, a true story of heroism and healing, had premiered 6 months earlier to critical acclaim and surprising ratings success. The film followed their story from the river rescue through the federal corruption investigation, but its real focus was on the healing power of chosen family and the extraordinary bonds between humans and animals. Kaiser lifted his head at the sound of celebration, his tail wagging with the enthusiasm that had never dimmed despite his advancing years. The documentary had made him famous beyond their small Montana community. But fame had never changed his essential nature. He was still the dog who brought Maggie her slippers each morning, who supervised Emily's bedtime routine with gentle authority, who positioned himself protectively between Sarah and strangers until he determined they were safe. "They want to do a follow-up documentary," Sarah announced after ending the call. "Something about the impact our story has had on animal rescue organizations and corruption investigations nationwide. The ripple effects of their ordeal had indeed been far-reaching." Assistant Director Carlton Hayes was serving consecutive life sentences in federal prison, his corruption network dismantled and prosecuted at every level. Jake Morrison had died in prison 18 months into his sentence, officially ruled a suicide, though the circumstances suggested that child killers rarely survived long behind bars. 17 federal agents, 12 prosecutors, and 34 local law enforcement officers had been convicted on charges ranging from corruption to conspiracy to commit murder. More positively, the Kaiser Foundation had revolutionized K-9 training programs nationwide, emphasizing the psychological care of service animals and establishing retirement protocols that ensured aging working dogs received the dignity and medical care they deserved. The foundation had also funded research into trauma recovery for both humans and animals, leading to breakthrough treatments for PTSD that benefited veterans, first responders, and abuse survivors. Emily bounced on Kaiser's bed, careful not to disturb his comfortable position, but unable to contain her excitement. "Can Kaiser be in another movie? Can I be in it too?" "We'll see, sweetheart," Maggie said, settling into her rocking chair with the contentment of someone who'd learned to appreciate each moment as it came. "But right now, I think Kaiser would rather help you with your reading homework than worry about being a movie star." The afternoon progressed with the comfortable rhythm that had developed over months of shared meals, shared responsibilities, and shared love. Sarah reviewed lesson plans while Emily practiced spelling words with Kaiser's patient supervision. The German Shepherd had an uncanny ability to sense when she was trying to skip difficult words and would nudge her gently back to task. Marcus worked on plans for the vegetable garden that would feed them through the next winter, his military precision ensuring maximum yield from every square foot of soil. As evening approached, they gathered for their daily walk around the property, a tradition that had evolved from Kaiser's physical therapy requirements into a family ritual of gratitude and reflection. The German Shepherd moved more slowly now, his gait careful but determined, his eyes still alert to every sound and movement that might threaten his chosen pack. The sunset painted the Montana sky in shades of pink and gold, the same colors that had illuminated the morning when three strangers and a hero dog had first found each other beside a raging river. But now they walked as family, their conversation punctuated by Emily's laughter, Marcus's quiet observations about wildlife, Sarah's stories from her classroom, and Maggie's occasional reminiscences about Frank and the FBI cases that had prepared her for the most important investigation of her career, the pursuit of happiness in her golden years. Kaiser paused at the spot where they'd built Emily Webb's memorial garden, a circle of wildflowers and butterflies that bloomed from spring through fall. He sat quietly for a moment, his intelligent eyes reflecting some understanding of the significance this place held for the man who'd become his surrogate grandfather. Marcus knelt beside him, his weathered hands gentle on the German Shepherd's graying fur. "She would have loved you, old boy," Marcus whispered, words meant for both the dog and the little girl whose death had brought them all together. "She would have loved all of this." As they completed their circuit and returned to the house, Kaiser positioned himself on the porch with the territorial satisfaction of someone who'd finally found home. The German Shepherd, who'd spent 3 years running from assassins, hiding in wilderness, and surviving on instinct and determination, had discovered something worth protecting more precious than his own life, a family that had chosen him as completely as he had chosen them. The last light faded from the western sky as they gathered around the dinner table, holding hands for the blessing that Marcus had instituted shortly after joining their household. The prayer was simple, non-denominational, focused on gratitude for second chances, chosen family, and the extraordinary capacity of the human heart to heal even the deepest wounds through love. "Thank you for bringing us together," Marcus said, his voice steady with the peace that had replaced years of rage and grief. "Thank you for Kaiser's courage, for Maggie's wisdom, for Sarah's strength, and for Emily's joy. Help us remember that every day is a gift, and help us use that gift to make the world a little better for someone else." Kaiser's soft woof served as the family's amen, and dinner began with the comfortable chaos of passing dishes, sharing stories from the day, and planning adventures for tomorrow. Outside, the Montana wilderness stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars, But inside their small house, the universe had contracted to the perfect size, large enough for love, laughter, and hope, but small enough that no one ever had to face their fears alone. At 78, Maggie O'Sullivan had finally learned the secret that had eluded her throughout her distinguished FBI career. The most important cases weren't solved with evidence and interrogation, but with patience, faith, and the willingness to believe that families could be found in the most unexpected places, sometimes with 4 legs, a tail, and a hero's heart that never stopped fighting for the people they loved. Sometimes the greatest heroes walk on 4 legs and teach us that love knows no boundaries. In our golden years, we discover that family isn't just about blood. It's about who shows up when life gets stormy, who chooses to stay when leaving would be easier, and who proves that it's never too late to start over with people who truly see our worth. Maggie, Sarah, Marcus, and Kaiser remind us that our best chapters might still be unwritten, waiting for the courage to open our hearts to unexpected love. Whether you're 55 or 85, whether you feel forgotten or overlooked, remember that heroes come in all forms, and sometimes they're waiting for you to rescue them right back. What unexpected friendship or chosen family member has brought the most joy to your life? Have you ever experienced a moment when helping someone else ended up healing your own heart in ways you never expected? Share your story below. We'd love to hear how love found you when you least expected it.